G'day Poetry Geeks, I'm Jackson and you are watching The Poetry Show. And in today's Poetry Show we are going to be discussing arguably the most important element of poetry that there is. Okay, so today's Poetry Show is going to be looking at how to include similes and metaphors into your poetry. Now, on the one hand, this is a very simple topic, and I'm going to cover the very simple elements of similes and metaphors first. But if you stick around towards the end of the video, or towards not even the end of the video, I'll be getting into some of the other considerations about what makes similes and metaphors particularly tick, and how you can go about creating your own in a way that's useful for you as a poet. Now, one of the other things I'll include in the description below is a series of links to different timestamps within this video. So if you feel like you understand the basic idea of what a simile or metaphor is, then you can just go to the description underneath and you can click on the link that will take you to the methods or the warning about cliches, that kind of thing. So the primary school definition of similes and metaphors, if you like, not that there's anything wrong with the primary school definition, but I just thought we'd start there. You probably know that a simile is a comparison between any two things using the words like or as. So for an example, you might say something is as blue as the sky, or you might say my brother eats like a pig. A metaphor, on the other hand, is also a kind of comparison, but it's one where you say that one thing is the other thing, without using the word like or as. And usually a strong metaphor comes from a comparison between two things that you wouldn't normally think of as being compared. So for example, instead of saying my brother eats like a pig, which would be a simile, I could simply say my brother is a pig. Now you know my brother is not a pig, but you understand the comparison that I'm making, that by saying my brother is a pig, I'm trying to associate all of the qualities of a pig with my brother. So that's basically what we try to do with similes and metaphors. So that's the really simple thing about similes and metaphors. They're very easy to use and they're very accessible for everybody. But there are some other things to consider as well. Firstly, you don't need to use those sentence stems or those phrases that I've used for those particular similes and metaphors. So for example, you might have a metaphor or a simile, the moon looked like blood. You know, you might have that as your simile. But you can take that simile, the moon looked like blood, and you can make it a lot more punchier and a lot more impactful if you simply refer to, at some point in your poem, the blood moon. Now you're not saying the moon is blood or the moon looks like blood, you're just calling it the blood moon, and you're making that mental association for people, and they can decide for themselves what it is, what qualities it is about blood, what qualities it is about the moon that you're trying to bring together in your poem. So you don't always have to use that sentence structure of the moon is or the moon looks like. So again, that's a very simple thing, but it's a way of freshening up your phraseology. The way you write your actual metaphors and similes is something to consider. Now, before we go any further, it's really important that we are aware of cliches. Now, a cliche is any phrase that you are used to hearing or seeing written down often. So if I were to use the example, blue as the sky for an example, everybody has heard the metaphor or the simile that something is as blue as the sky or blue as the ocean. What we try to do with a simile or a metaphor is to get the reader to think very carefully about the imagery that we're trying to use and the ideas we're trying to put into their head. The idea of a poem, and particularly a poem that's using similes or metaphors, is to try and get the reader to look at something in a fresh way and to make associations for themselves that they would not necessarily have made. So the idea of using a simile or a metaphor is to get people thinking carefully and thinking deeply about the images that you're presenting them with. The danger with using a cliche is a shortcut to thinking. We use cliches when we think we already know something, when we think that something is obvious, and instead of actually inspiring us to think, cliches shut our thinking down. So you need to avoid using cliches when you're coming up with your own similes and metaphors. Now, if you're not sure if something is a cliche, in this day and age, it's very easy to do a very quick Google search and just find out if people have used the phrase that you've come up with. Because you might find that it's not a phrase you came up with, you just had it squirreled away in the back of your head somewhere, and actually everybody said that all of the time previously, and it's not as strong a simile or metaphor as you wanted to use. So with that warning in mind, that we want to avoid cliches, what are some of the ways that you can actually come up with your own metaphors and your own similes? Well, there is some very bad advice about this floating about on the internet. There is one video in particular that I've seen reasonably recently. It's an old video, but I saw it recently, where this woman is trying to explain how you can write poems. And she gives an example of how to come up with interesting similes and metaphors. Now, I'm not going to link to this video because I think it is incredibly poor advice, but I'll share it with you anyway. She makes the suggestion that you can write down lots of emotions and feelings, and then she says on little scraps of paper, and then she says write down ordinary everyday objects. The first things that come to mind, write those on little scraps of paper, then mush them all up on the table, give them a bit of a shuffle, and then pick them out at random, and then you can put them together and you might come up with good associations. Now, these are completely and truly random associations. And one of the examples that she comes up with, for example, is the sausage of happiness. Now, that's not particularly worthwhile to include in a poem because it's not something that you, as a poet, felt you wanted to try and communicate to your reader. Instead, what it is a random selection of words that have been thrown together. Now, there is a type of poetry called found poetry where people do bring together interesting things that they found, and they feel that in the randomness of life, in the things that they just come across, sometimes poetry pops up. And there is something to be said for that. But if you are trying to craft a poem yourself and you want it to be your ideas embedded within the poem, then this random assault of words is not really an effective way. So I would say of all of the methods for coming up with similes and metaphors, this kind of random shuffling is bad, and it gives poetry a bad name, because if people believe that that's all it takes to be a poet, then it's very easy to dismiss the very careful and the very considered work that poets do. So if the first method is random association, and that's no good, the second method I would share with you is a little bit better, and I would call that subconscious association. So here you're actually coming up with your own links between things that you think are random, but they're not being left to some sort of random chance. It's not like picking up various words off of the table. It's you deciding, if I think of happiness, what's the first object that pops into my head? So I might, for example, have, teacup, or cup of tea. Now, for me, that might be that's not a random association. It's not a truly random association, but it might be a subconscious one. It's one that's just popped to the surface. When I think of happiness, I think of tea. Again, it's a little bit random, and it's probably not that thoughtful a method of coming up with similes and metaphors. But at least what it is it's your brain offering you a connection that it thinks it's worthwhile. So sometimes you can trust your subconscious to kind of deliver these ideas to you, and you can listen to them and you can determine whether they're useful. So you might have, for example, the teacup of happiness, or the happy teacup sits before me. Now, I'm not saying that's a great simile or a great metaphor. I'm just saying that's an example. In fact, I'm definitely not saying it's a good example. So I happen to think random, truly random, is terrible. Subconscious, maybe there's something to subconscious. The third way that you can come up with similes and metaphors is actually in another video that I saw, and this was a TED Talk where a very good series of exercises and ideas was introduced for helping you write poetry. And one of the things that this person talks about is particularly similes and metaphors. Now, I will put a link to this one down below because I happen to think that the ideas they've shared are very good. Now, one of the things they suggest is when you are thinking about the moment or the thing that you are trying to describe, also think, if this thing were an animal, what kind of animal would it be? If this thing were a daily routine, what daily routine would it be? If this thing were a game or a sport, what game or sport would it be? And he comes up with a list of 4 or 5 different associations. Now again, this almost seems like it's a little bit random, but this is actually an intentional association. So rather than relying on your subconscious, you're relying on your actual thinking it through. You're thinking, if I intentionally think about the associations I want to make between 2 unlike things, what comes up? And I think this is a pretty good way of coming up with similes and metaphors, because it's you deciding in the context of your poem what manner of objects is it appropriate to compare. So you as the poet are having to put a little bit of work into it. So you might come up with a list of 5 or 6 different associations, and then from that list you can pick the one that really works within the context of your poem. So there's a little bit more thinking, a little bit more engagement with you and your mind in that process. Now, because that comes from another video, I'll actually link to that down below, and you can check that video out and you'll be able to see that explained in a little bit more detail. But my favourite method for coming up with similes and metaphors is what I would call the realised association. And that is where you have got to a point where you, in your engagement with life and in your engagement with your emotions and the various objects that you interact with on a day-to-day basis, you begin to realise similarities and associations between things that other people might not have come across. Now, I was supposed to have a prop for this and I forgot, because I'm very poorly organised and this is not a professional show, as I've said before. But let's say, for example, if I were drinking from a nice cold cup of water, or a nice cool glass of water, and the glass that I have in the kitchen is actually a very kind of fragile looking glass. So I might think, you know, this glass is something, you have to imagine, this glass that I'm holding in my hand is filled with water, and water is the stuff of life. Water is the thing that gives me life, and yet it's held in this vessel that is delicate and quite breakable. And if I decided to, if I squeezed hard enough, I could shatter that. And shattering it would injure me, it would cut my hand, it would cause all sorts of grief, but that is something I could do. So I've got this kind of aesthetically pleasing, this beautiful object that contains the stuff of life, the stuff that sustains me, and if I wanted to, I could crush it in my hands. So thinking that through, I might think, well, that kind of reminds me of the human heart. The human heart is something that gives me life. It's something that is beautiful, and there's all of these kind of poetic associations with the heart anyway. And then I might think, well, I might then start to draw that comparison between my heart and this fragile glass. Now, that kind of realised association is good. In fact, I would argue it's the best way to come up with your similes and your metaphors. But did you notice that the association I came up with there was a cliche? The idea of a heart made of glass has been done 1,000 times before. So even though that was something that came to me organically, just because I feel like that's an important association, as a poet, I have to decide, well, is that really fresh enough for my poem? And I think that particular example, maybe not. So sometimes as a poet, you have to be willing to get rid of the good stuff because it just isn't good enough. And that can be heartbreaking, but it's worth it in the long run. So just as a quick recap, my 4 methods for coming up with similes and metaphors. You've got the random association, which is terrible and you should never do it. It's a bad idea. You've got subconscious association, which is where you just try and make some connections randomly. You just let whatever comes into your mind be the association and you see if it stands. Then you've got the intentional association, where you go through a predetermined list of which animal is this like, which game is this like, anything like that. And the video I'm going to link to makes some suggestions. I would add to that list though. You can add any other associations you want as well. But you try and intentionally come up with your associations. And then the 4th association is the realised association, where you, in your day-to-day life, in your observances, in your just watching things happen and experiencing life as it happens, you begin to realise that there is an association between some things, and that is what you want to share with the world. So that's my advice for similes and metaphors, and I hope you found it helpful. If you have any questions, or if any of this was a little bit unclear, please do leave me a comment in the comments below, and I will try and get back to you and answer more fully and more eloquently if I can. And if you've enjoyed this particular video, you can check out other videos in this series by checking out the playlist that this is a part of, How to Write Better Poetry, or you can subscribe to this channel and there'll be one of these videos every Saturday morning. That's in Melbourne time. And if you also are interested in my take on a few classic poems, famous poems, and maybe poems you haven't heard of, then you can also look at my poetry analysis playlist as well, which again, these kind of pop up randomly on my channel just whenever I've got time. And if there's any poem you'd like me to cover, that you'd like me to talk about in any kind of detail, then again, just leave me a comment and I'll usually get around to it eventually. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.